Today we're going to hear a couple more talks that get into various topics, stepping on the fundamentals that we've covered over the past 2 days. Our first lecture is by Andy Clegg, who is the CTO of Valo Analytica. Valo? Andy, hopefully you'll correct me if I'm butchering your company's name. This is a new firm that specializes in spectrum data analytics. Before that, he was the former spectrum engineer lead for Google, where he was the principal architect of the US Citizens Broadband Radio Service. So this is the first spectrum sharing technology really that took off commercially available. Before Google, he was the program director for electromagnetic spectrum management at the National Science Foundation, where he created the US government's first ever grant program dedicated to radio spectrum research. He previously worked for Cellular Wireless, which is now AT&T, or Singular Wireless, sorry, which is now AT&T, ComSearch, and the U.S. Naval Research Laboratory, and was a summer student at the National Radio Astronomy Observatory at Charlottesville. He holds a bachelor's in physics and astronomy from the University of Virginia and a PhD in radio astronomy with a minor in electrical engineering from Cornell University, where he particularly enjoyed observing with the VLA, which we all know what it is right now, and Arecibo radio telescopes, and having occasional conversations with Carl Sagan. And so when I was reading Andy's bio, all sounds amazing, right? But what really struck me is that he knew Carl Sagan. So this is a big deal for me. If my dad knew that I know someone who knows Carl Sagan, it would be a huge deal for him. So a show of hands, we were wondering with Andy, do you guys know who Carl Sagan is? Okay, 1, 2, 3 in Albany.
Okay, all right.
Shows of hands. Okay, good. Andy, I think.
Handfuls. Yeah.
I think he's making it through the generations, so that's great. All right, so with that, Andy, please take it away. We're so happy to have you talk to us.
Okay. Yep. Thanks, Maria. Thanks for the introduction. And can you hear me okay, everybody? Puerto Rico and Albany and everybody? Raise your hand if you can hear. They can in the room. Okay, cool. All right, thank you. All right, looks like everybody can hear. All right, thanks. Thanks for the introduction. And yes, I was a astronomy and physics major here at UVA before any of you were born. Maybe even before Anya was born. I'm not sure. I'm not going to ask her. I'm not going to ask her. But I saw on the list that there is at least one person here who's also in astronomy. Yes. Okay. There you go. Good. That's all right. That's how I started. So, are you first year or are you third year? Okay. That's the hardest year, that is the hardest year, by the way. I'm just giving you.
First year was, in my opinion, the hardest.
Which year?
Well, because I went to community college.
And transferred here?
Yeah, and that was really hard.
Oh, okay. All right. Yeah. I did all 4 years here, and the third year was the hardest. Like I spent like problem sets that, you'd see like there's only 2 problems on the problem set. You'd be like, how hard could that be? And then, you find out that, that leaves. Yeah. Anyway, that was brings back nightmares. So it's a great place. Thank you. And I was also a summer student here in this building while I was a student at UVA. So it's kind of cool to come back. And in fact, I had not been back to this building since I was a summer student here. So it was really cool to see everything again. And so very cool. I've been tuning into most of the lectures remotely. I can attest to the fact that the front microphones are very sensitive. And apparently some of you were making rooster noises on Thursday. So I did hear the rooster noises on Thursday. Or maybe that came from Puerto Rico. I'm not sure. So anyway, yeah, thanks for having me. By the way, I realized I grabbed this book off my shelf before I headed down here. If anybody's interested in the early days of radio astronomy, this is a really good book. It's a fascinating history of the early days of radio astronomy. It's called Cosmic Noise by Woody Sullivan. Unfortunately, I went on Amazon yesterday because I was going to send the link if anybody wanted it. It's $493 on Amazon. So I recommend getting this out of the library, not buying your own copy. I don't know why it's so expensive. They do have a copy in the library here. But if you can get it out of the library and you're interested in how radio astronomy came to be in some of the early days, Jansky and Reber and things, take a look at that book. It's a really good book. So anyway, I'm going to talk. I know that Prashant.
Andy, if you can share a pointer for everyone, that would still be great.
Could I do send the link or whatever?
Yes, once we're done here, and we'll remind you.
Yep, we'll do that. Good thought, Maria. So I'm going to fill in today, the goal is a couple of things. I'm going to fill in a little bit about what Prashant talked about on Thursday. He touched on spectrum regulation and things like that. I'm going to give a little bit more detail about that and how the process works. And then I'm going to give some examples of spectrum sharing and why we need to do spectrum sharing, which is kind of obvious because spectrum isn't so much demand, but I'll talk a little bit about specific examples of spectrum sharing. So if there are some takeaways you come up with in this first part of the talk, it's this. So the federal government gets to decide who gets to use the radio spectrum, and there's two agencies that get to do that: the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, which we're all aware of, and another one that we may not be as aware of, which is the National Telecommunications and Information Administration. I'll talk about the difference in a minute. There is, when the FCC makes rules, they can't just do it willy-nilly. There is a required public process that has to go through. So you can participate, anybody can participate in the process in creating rules for using the radio spectrum. And one of the main ways to create orderly use of the spectrum and make sure people aren't interfering with each other is through the process of spectrum allocations and what we call service rules, which are the rules that you actually have to operate under. So that's kind of the key of this first part. So let's go through some of this. So your next lecture, I'm not going to talk too much about the economics of spectrum because Professor Randy Berry is the next talk, and he's an economist, and he'll give you all the details. But it's been estimated in the US alone that the radio spectrum is essentially about a $2 trillion a year asset. So it's a big deal, and that's why it's a growing concern and growing interest on Congress, the White House, everything. It's a big deal. The estimate comes from, you look at what wireless is used for, Wi-Fi, cellular, aviation radar, ship-to-shore communications, military systems. I mean, it's like almost everything in the economy somehow, and defense, touches radio spectrum. So if you assign 10% of the US gross domestic product to be somehow related to the use of the radio spectrum, that's where you get the $2 trillion figure, because the radio, the U.S. economy, the GDP is about $20 trillion or so. So it's a big deal, and it's why we have to make good use of it. It's also why there's so much competition for its use, and that impacts radio astronomy and remote sensing, things like that. So I would imagine, I saw a lot of you were double E majors, or at least physics majors, which is better than being a double E major, by the way. You agree, right? Okay. So you're familiar with Maxwell's equations, Maxwell's laws, and this impacts how things are developed, what governs electromagnetically and physically how the spectrum can be used. But the argument is that the regulations are just as important as Maxwell's equations, because you could come up with the greatest idea in the world for using the radio spectrum, but if you can't get it through the regulatory process, you may have well not have thought of it at all, because you'll never be able to deploy it. Nobody will ever be able to use it. So regulations are as important as Maxwell's equations, and you realize that quickly when you start developing systems that use the radio spectrum. Okay, so how is this spectrum regulated in a little bit more detail than what you saw on Thursday? So in the US, we have kind of a unique system. There's two different regulators for the radio spectrum. There is this one that most of you probably until recently have not heard of, the National Telecommunications and Information Administration. It's part of the Department of Commerce. They regulate the use of the radio spectrum by all federal government agencies. So like DOD, FAA, NSF, all of the federal government agencies, when they want to use the radio spectrum, they have to work through the NTIA to get permission for an authorization or whatever in order to use the radio spectrum. On the other hand, everybody else, including you, businesses, individuals, state and local governments, everybody but the federal government has to go through the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC. That's the regulator for everyone but federal government users. So we have this kind of unique structure of having two different regulators in the United States, which does create complications on occasion, because now you have basically twice the headache if you have to arrange something to use in the radio spectrum, and it touches on both NTIA and FCC. And then from the international perspective, There is international regulation, and I put regulation in quotes because of a caveat I'll say down here at the bottom. There is the International Telecommunication Union, the ITU. It is a specialized agency of the United Nations. And so all 190 some member nations of the United Nations are members of the ITU. And once every about 4 years, they all come together and look at the existing rules and regulations, international rules and regulations, decide what needs to be tweaked, deleted, added, whatever. They all have to come to an agreement. This meeting takes, a month or so, thousands of people there, a lot of political fighting and stuff like that going on. And at the end of the conference, called the World Radio Communication Conference, you come to an agreement among all of these countries as to the changes you're going to make to the rules. And then you sign these. And this thing has the force of an international treaty. So the regulation is in the form of an international treaty, which is actually called the ITU radio regulations. You go online and look at the radio regulations if you want. So that's how the process is very slow. In fact, to get onto the agenda of one meeting, they're only held every 4 years, and to get onto the agenda of one meeting, you have to do that at the previous meeting. So if you have a great idea, it can take 8 years or more to get it through the ITU. This is a big problem because this is not sustainable. You look at the pace of technology today, we can't have 8-year timescales to get new radio things. So I'm not a big fan of the ITU. There are certain circumstances where it's very important, like aviation and things where planes go all over the world, and you have to kind of have standardize how the spectrum is used and stuff like that. But if you have some really cool idea and you need to get international regulations through, the satellite operators are dealing with this regularly. The timescale is very, very long. And I put regulation in quotation marks because the ITU has no enforcement authority. So if a country decides to go rogue and operate whatever they want in the radio spectrum and interfere with another country, there's no ITU police. There's really nothing, dramatic that you can do. It's just like if a country decides to invade another country, as we're seeing currently, there's not a whole lot that can be done. You just kind of have to hope that countries behave, and they don't always behave. So there's really no regulation in the sense that there's anything enforceable that you can force enforcement actions on other countries. But it is, we do come to this agreement through the ITU radio regulations of how the spectrum is going to be used. And by the way, part of the radio regulations is an individual country can use the radio spectrum in a way that's not consistent with the radio regulations, as long as they don't interfere with a country that is abiding by the radio regulations. So here in the US, we can do what we want as long as we don't interfere, for example, with Canada and Mexico, two bordering countries and things like that. And our rules are not consistent with all of the ITU radio regulations. We have differences from the radio regulations, but we make sure we do it in a manner and we coordinate with Canada and Mexico and satellite operators and things. We don't interfere with them. So you don't have to abide by the radio regulations as a country, but you just can't interfere with another country. And by the way, as we're going along, feel free to ask questions. I'd rather have questions asked, during the talk, so we make it a little more interactive. And people online, just shout out or whatever if you have a question, or you can text it to Anya and we can push it through here.
Is one of the red pen?
Okay. Oh yes.
So is there a team that's actively monitoring if there's any interference between countries, and if so, do they meet up in a meeting room to decide what happened? If there's a proper explanation to why they interfered in another country's radio.
So yes and no. It's a bit of an ad hoc basis. So we coordinate and
Andy, if you don't mind repeating the question.
Yeah. I was going to say, could you hear the question online? Yeah. The question was, is there a process where countries actively monitor for interference coming from other countries, and how is that worked out when it happens? It's a bit of an ad hoc process. I'm familiar with how we deal with Canada mostly. There is a process for the Canadian regulator to communicate to the US regulator, the FCC, that interference is being received. And it's usually isolated to a particular, if it's in a particular band, then people know generally who the players are because we know who's licensed for those bands in the two different countries. And then the federal government has a bilateral meeting. So the US government regulator will meet with the Canadian government regulator, and they will work on exchanging the details of the interference issue. That will be communicated to the operators in the US if it's the US causing the interference, for example, and the FCC will say you need to fix this. There are bilateral agreements between Canada and the US for specific bands. So different bands in the radio spectrum, many have actual treaties between Canada and the US that says, the US cannot put more than this much power across the border. Canada can't put more than this much power across the border, other details. And if you exceed those limits, that's when Canada and Mexico, or Canada and the US will start having to work out who's at fault and who does it and who needs to fix it. And then that ultimately falls on the shoulders of the operators who are causing the interference. So that's how the Canada and the US does it. It's a slow process. It's a bureaucratic process, but it generally works. Europe, out of necessity, their rules are a little more unified because you think of Europe and they have all these little countries and radio signals, they don't stop at borders. Because there are so many countries crammed into such a little area, their rules need to be a lot more harmonized because otherwise they would be causing interference to each other frequently. So the short answer to your question is yes, there is a process. It's slow and clunky, and it's usually dealt with by bilateral agreements between the two countries. If the two countries are in friendly terms with each other, like Canada and US generally are. If the interference is between countries that are not friendly with each other, it can get messy. You can take complaints to the ITU, and then probably nothing will ever happen because like I say, countries don't always work together very well. But yeah, in our country, we tend to do this by bilateral negotiations with the involved countries. So it's a good question. Okay, so you've seen this chart many times. This is a famous NTIA spectrum allocation chart. You can get a copy online, or I'm not sure they're handing out hard copies here. You can get a PDF online. You can buy hard copies from the government printing office. You aren't really considered a serious lab in wireless research unless you have one of these posters hanging in your laboratory somewhere. Yeah, or your home, and then you're really geeky. So, a little more detail about what this is. The way we decide who gets to use what part of the radio spectrum is that every part of the radio spectrum that is in practice usable is allocated to one or more services. And a service is a high-level description of a type of thing that can operate in the band. And I'll have a close-up of the services. But each color in here corresponds to one of the 30 different high-level services that's allocated each block of the spectrum. This is a chart that goes from 3 kilohertz in the upper left to 300 gigahertz here. And it's kind of logarithmic in that the frequency width of each bar is 10 times the width of the one above it. Mostly because the way we use spectrum and consume bandwidth is kind of logarithmic. We use more bandwidth at higher frequencies than at lower frequencies. So, some things stand out here, like the blue, big blocks of blue. Does anybody want to venture a guess as to what the blue color is on the spectrum chart that stands out? Yes.
I know the really big one is AM.
Right, exactly. Yeah, it's broadcast. So this is AM broadcast, FM broadcast, TV broadcast. It looks like a lot of spectrum is allocated to broadcast. It looks like AM is really large, and it's mostly because this block is only a little less than 3 megahertz wide, and the AM band is more than a megahertz wide, and so it looks like it consumes a lot of spectrum. But again, this block is 10 times, this line is 10 times the frequency range of this line. So if the AM broadcast band was on this line, it would be 10 times smaller. So it really stands out here just because it's a big consumer of that particular band or that fractional bandwidth. But broadcast does use a fair amount of spectrum, and it's questionable whether it's really necessary to use that much spectrum for broadcast, because not many of us really rely on the AM radio or FM radio anymore. Most people in their car are listening to Sirius XM or streaming or something like that. So, and hardly anybody watches over-the-air TV. So it's a lot of questions about whether we really need this much spectrum for broadcast. By the way, radio astronomy is bright yellow on here. So the 1420 megahertz line is, I believe it's here. It's too fuzzy to read, but somewhere around here. But bright yellow is radio astronomy, and as you go up in frequencies towards the 30 to 300 gigahertz range, there's actually a fair amount of allocation to radio astronomy, and that's from the great work of people at NRAO like Harvey Liss and NSF like Tom Durdsley, who managed to score those allocations at the ITU back in the like in 2000 or so. So anyway, a little bit of a detailed look. Oh, by the way, I was talking about the value of spectrum. I've highlighted just a little chunk of spectrum here that was one of the most recent spectrum auctions. So one of the ways that the FCC issues licenses, if there's demand by more than one party for a given band, they hold an auction, a spectrum auction. It usually takes a few weeks to run. You register for the auction, have to demonstrate that you're qualified, that you've got money, you're a legitimate business, you're US owned, blah, blah, blah. And you go up against other companies, you go through an auction, usually takes a few weeks or so online. And you increase your bid until the bidding activity gets to a peak. And then they issue the licenses to the highest bidders. So this is a particular band that's now used for 5G in the United States, the 3.7 gigahertz band. And this was an auction that was held a couple of years ago. Verizon, AT&T, T-Mobile, Dish Network, kind of the usual suspects were the winners. And just for that little piece of spectrum right here out of this whole chart, they paid a combined $81 billion to get a license for that spectrum. And that's just one of their bands. They've bought spectrum for other bands too. Since 1994, when spectrum auctions started, the US has raised over $240 billion in auction fees to help cover the cost. And that money almost all that money goes to the US Treasury to pay down debt or to pay for particular projects and things like that. So if you wonder, like when you pay your cell phone bill every month, why is it so expensive? Where's the money going? All that other kind of stuff. A chunk of it is going to pay down the $81 billion they paid just for that one band. But 5G is considered so important to the US that that's why the FCC made that band available. They had to clear some other stuff out of that band and auctioned it. So kind of a big deal, very expensive, and spectrum auctions will continue for the foreseeable future. If you zoom up on the chart just a little bit so we can actually read it, this is what it looks like in detail. I've just pulled up a random section around 25 megahertz, which is part of the shortwave band. And here you can start to see the different specific services that are allocated for particular bands. So, radio astronomy is one. It has an allocation around 25 megahertz. This is not highly used. It used to be used to study Jupiter and solar emissions and things like that. This broadcasting thing is for shortwave broadcasting. Land mobile, that's for like ship-to-shore communications. Maritime mobile is for ship-to-shore communications. There's some land mobile for walkie-talkies and things like that operate in the 26 megahertz band. Aeronautical mobile, so that's for air traffic control when planes are out over the open ocean and they need essentially shortwave radio to reach it. So anyway, it gives you an idea of the different colors of the different services. Here are the 30 different services that it's defined into. And again, the service is sort of a high level descriptor of a system. It's not the actual system. So you may be wondering, like, what's the decoder between the things you're actually familiar with and what service they operate under? Here, I've just given a few examples. Cell phones operate under a radio service of land mobile or fixed. So that means that if you wanted to deploy a cell phone system and you were going to go to the FCC for a license, besides the auction complexity, which you have to worry about, but besides that, you'd need to look for bands that are allocated to the land mobile or mobile service. You can't just choose any band willy-nilly. Same thing if you want to operate a radar, you need to find bands that are allocated to the radio location service. GPS operates under the radio navigation satellite service. So, you know, if you want to know where GPS operates, you've got to start by looking for the radio navigation satellite bands. Broadcasting, we already covered TV, AM, and FM. Satellite TV and satellite radio, like Sirius XM, they operate under the broadcasting satellite service allocation. So, and on, you know, different services, specific applications operate under kind of high-level services, and those services have allocations in the radio spectrum, and that's where you need to look to find bandwidth to deploy your actual application. There's a couple of special cases here that I'll talk about in a minute. Yeah.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
I have a question about the last slide.
Yeah.
You're ready.
Yes.
On the far left, for the first one, the black box at the bottom
Yes.
says it's for federal and non-federal.
Yeah.
The use case above it says federal only. It's the same frequency. How does that work?
Okay, so in the allocation chart, okay, so it's a little hard to see. There is that's a detail of the allocation chart that I glossed over. So if you notice at the bottom, there is a color code. It's either green, red, or black. And you may not be able to see because it doesn't show, but that color code actually can be found up here as well in the middle of the chart. So what it means is like, okay, so let's look at this band. It's black down at the bottom and it's red up here. So what it means is the allocation directly above the black box can be used by either federal government or non-federal government stations. The allocation above the red box can only be used by federal government. So if you wanted to operate in that band, if you wanted to operate a fixed, something that corresponds to the fixed service, either federal government or non-federal government can do it. But if you wanted to operate a mobile system in that band, that's only allowed by federal government stations because of this little red box. I know it's kind of hard to see because it looks a little pinkish like the fixed service allocation, but that's sort of an additional thing. And here, like the green ones, those are allocations like amateur and amateur satellites. There's no such thing as a federal government amateur radio operator. They're only they're only citizens, non-federal government people. So that's why the amateur radio service is only green, and that means it's non-federal government only. Okay. So,
Thank you.
Yep. So a couple of special cases that we have to describe here. Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. Why is it that you can buy a Wi-Fi router that transmits a signal and you can take it home and use it, and you didn't have to deal with the FCC at all? You didn't have to go get a license from the FCC to use it. The reason is it operates under a special rule part in the FCC rules called Part 15, or unlicensed devices. It basically says if your device is sufficiently low power, or if it operates in these special bands where we allow these things to operate as long as they correspond to maximum power levels and out-of-band emissions and things like that, you can do it without a license. So these are typically referred to as unlicensed devices, and they're governed by Part 15 of the FCC rules. Another example of something you don't specifically need a license for, a microwave oven. Your microwave oven emits very high levels of radio energy. That's how it heats food. It is unlicensed, but it operates under a different rule part, Part 18, called Industrial, Scientific, and Medical Equipment. So as long as you have things that use radio waves for other purposes other than communications, like heating things, like food, you can operate under Part 18. You have to stay in certain bands, but you can use very high power. In fact, there's no power limit for Part 18. If you wanted to operate an industrial, scientific, and medical thing, as long as you do it in certain bands, and your equipment meets other FCC rules, you can transmit as much power as you want. There's no power limit for Part 18 system. So those are not particular services in the US. Yes.
Just thinking about microwaves and maybe products more generally. If
Yeah.
you buy a product and it's acting like out of its band, does that responsibility fall on you or the company that you bought it from?
You're the operator, so you're the one who has to remedy it. And this happens sometimes. There was a case of a cell phone display that had blinking lights and all sorts of things that wasn't related to the cell phones, it was related to the display. And it was causing interference to police radio communications in the area. The cell phone store that was operating that display was the one that was held responsible for fixing the problem. So it's you as the operator. Now, if there's a manufacturing issue and the FCC determines like every device made by this particular company or every device of a particular model made by this company is faulty, the company will also be called in to fix it. Maybe even, you know, have to have a recall on their devices. But if it's a one-off kind of thing, the operator of the device is the one who's responsible for it. And there can be, I'm going to get to that in a minute, there can be big fines for intentionally violating the FCC rules. You have to watch out when you guys are developing your SDR projects later. Don't go rogue. You don't want the FCC coming after you. So NTIA basics, again, this is the entity that governs the federal government use of the radio spectrum. So they're part of the Department of Commerce. One of the ways they operate is they have what's called the IRAC, the Inter-Department Radio Advisory Committee. It's representatives of every government agency that uses the radio spectrum. They get together on a regular basis and they hash out all the details of radio spectrum use among the federal government agencies. I represented the NSF on the IRAC for 10 years or so. Most of the meetings are like watching paint dry, and if you have something on the agenda and it's item number 85 out of 120, you know, it's pretty painful, but the process works more or less. It is a little slow and painful, but it works. They are, by the way, if you're into wonky government minutia, they are the IRAC is the longest continuously operating government advisory committee. It's been holding meetings continuously since 1922. And some days when you're sitting in an IRAC meeting, it feels like it's been since 1920. It's pretty slow. So they do publish their rules. It's called the Manual of Regulations and Procedures for Federal Radio Frequency Management, often referred to just as the Red Book because it used to come in this big red binder. Now it's just a PDF you get online. So you can go, anybody can download it and see the rules if you want to operate a federal government radar, what all the rules are and stuff like that. Frequency assignments that the federal government uses, those are not public. And the reason they're not public is a lot of that stuff is sensitive. So for example, the actual database where the government frequency assignments, the specific frequencies used for specific purposes, it's in a thing called the Government Master File or the GMF. The reason it's classified or not publicly releasable is because it has things like, if the Department of Justice wants to have body-worn microphones so that, when they do stings and they go out and get, gang members and stuff like that by having hidden microphones that they record the conversations. They actually have to get frequency assignments for that. You obviously don't want people knowing what the frequency assignments for sensitive things like that are. So the GMF is not public. Same thing with the specific frequencies that DoD military radars operate on and stuff like that. It's in the GMF, but it's not publicly available. You can't get a copy of it. It's either every assignment is either classified or not publicly releasable. There are limited exceptions. There are Freedom of Information Acts asking for benign information. Like if somebody came to the NSF and said, hey, we want to know what frequencies the VLA receives on, or what frequencies your cloud radar transmits on up in Alaska or whatever, we would provide that information because that's not, nobody's going to kill anybody with that information. We would release it, but generally the stuff is not released and not public. Okay, so the FCC, again, this is the other agency. This is the one we're all familiar with, and this is the one that would regulate all of us. The VLA, by the way, and NRAO, radio astronomy, all radio astronomy allocations are both federal government and non-federal government. So they would be one of those black bars in the allocation chart. So it's kind of a funny thing. Because NSF funds most of the radio telescopes in the country, it's generally handled through the NTIA allocations and assignments for like the VLA and Green Bank and things. It's usually handled through the NTIA. NSF handles the assignments and things like that. But there are also university radio telescopes and things. They go through the FCC to get authorizations. And all the radio telescopes receive only, so they don't technically need assignments or licenses, but registration is a good thing because it lets other people know you're there and they can protect you when they look in the database. So the FCC is a kind of a political organization. It's the Federal Communications Commission is actually 5 people. That's literally what the FCC is. It's 5 people. They are the commissioners of the FCC. Typically, there's 3 from the president's party and 2 from the other party at any given time. Right now, the FCC, because the commissioners have to be confirmed by the Senate, and that whole process is bogged down. There's actually only 3 commissioners right now, 2 Republicans and one Democrat. So it is political and getting more political by the day, essentially, like everything else. But the FCC's charge is to respond to private sector initiatives for the use of the radio spectrum, and they have a mandate to act in the public interest. The decisions that the FCC makes are subject to court review. I've got a slide about the process here, and if that process turns out to be completely unsatisfactory for some party, they can take the FCC to court. Historically, there had been a precedent called the Chevron deference, related to a Supreme Court case involving Chevron from years ago, that basically says if you take a government agency to court, the court is generally to defer to the expertise of the government agency in making its decision. Because courts, judges and stuff, they have no expertise in highly technical radio spectrum and related things. So the court, if the FCC comes and tells the court, here's why we ruled on this basis and these technical reasons, the court's not going to second guess the FCC. That was the process until last year. Last year, there was a Supreme Court case where involving commercial fishing ends up, being related to the FCC. But the short end of that was that the Supreme Court nullified the Chevron deference and said, actually, no, courts have a legal obligation to separately assess even the technical details in deciding a case. So now, if somebody takes the FCC to court, they don't have, before it was almost impossible to win on any kind of technical argument because the court would just say whatever the FCC says goes. Now the court has to assess even the technical issues on its own. This has opened up the possibility that every time the FCC does something that some big company doesn't like, they'll take them to court and it'll bog down the process forever. That hasn't come to be yet, but this has only been in place for about a year. So we'll see what happens, but this kind of new era where you can take the FCC to court and get basically a second hearing in a court rather than going through the FCC process, that's a big deal, and we'll have to kind of watch on what happens. So the FCC's authority actually dates back a long way. It goes back, they originally created this thing called the Federal Radio Commission back in 1927, back when, not long after Marconi and others and the first AM broadcast stations came online, they started interfering with each other. So Congress said we need an authority to organize this process. And then a few years later in 1934, they started realizing they're going to need to regulate telephones and telegraphs and things like that too. So they sort of redid the act and created the Federal Communications Commission by way of the Communications Act of 1934. And so the FCC looks at wireless and wireline communications regulations. And amazingly enough, today's telecommunications regulations and rules still are based upon the Communications Act of 1934. So it's like a 90-year-old Communications Act. We're still basing our rules today. It's been amended, over the years, but fundamentally, we still trace back all of our rules and regulations to the Communications Act of 1934. So the Congress created the Communications Act of 1934. It gave the FCC some high-level permissions of what it's going to regulate. And those are in what's called the U.S. Code, which is where all the U.S. Federal rules and laws are kept, are written. And the FCC's high-level rules are in Title 47 of the U.S. Code, in case you want to look. But those show the high-level descriptions of what authority Congress has given to the FCC as a result of the Communications Act of 1934. So then, if you want to actually see what the detailed FCC rules are, like if you wanted to design a widget to operate in the spectrum, what are your power limits? How much bandwidth can it use? What frequencies are you eligible to apply for? All that other kind of stuff. The details of how you use of what you have to do. The details of the FCC rules are in sort of a parallel thing called Title 47 of the Code of Federal Regulations, CFR. That's where, this is like 1,000 pages long. It's divided up into satellite services, mobile services, all sorts of different applications, many different rule parts. And that's, I talked earlier about how unlicensed devices are Part 15. That refers to Part 15 of Title 47. The link in the presentation will take you to an online resource operated by the government called the eCFR. Really good resource if you're going to do any kind of development and if you're doing anything to do that touches radio spectrum rules and regulations in the US, you need to be familiar with the CFR and read the rules. It's a little bit of a slog to read through all those rules, but that's what you're going to be operating under in the United States. The FCC's rules have the force of law. So that's one of the things that the Congress has passed down to the FCC through the Communications Act. So these are actual laws. If you violate them, you are subject primarily to financial penalties that the FCC can and does impose on people for violating the rules. And if it's an egregious enforcement issue, the FCC can even refer it to the Department of Justice and throw people in prison. The FCC has a bureau called the Enforcement Bureau, which is tasked with enforcement actions. They are almost always understaffed. They don't have enough funding. But one thing that they really do pay a lot of attention to is illegal use of the broadcast band. If you put up an illegal FM radio transmitter and want to serve your neighbors or neighborhood or whatever with an FM station of your own, the FCC really cracks down on that. Every week or two, you'll see an enforcement action where they go after people for doing this. So my recommendation is you're going to, if you want to violate the FCC rules, don't do that. Do something else that they enforce less. Actually, you shouldn't violate the rules at all, but I really recommend you not create your own FM radio station and put it up. Just as a example, I don't know why. Okay, so just as an example, I got the slide a little bit out of order. One of the biggest fines they've levied against somebody for illegal broadcast operation was this guy in New York who was operating, what was it called? Radio Impact 02. He was cited for illegal FM broadcast operation. And the worst part about it is he ignored the citation, didn't reply to the FCC, ignored all the FCC communications, which is the absolute worst thing you can do. And in the end, the FCC, because of this guy's non-compliance and not even recognizing the FCC's communications, issued him a fine of $2.3 million for operating this illegal FM broadcast solution. And they, this is the federal government that's fining you this, so they have infinite power to come after you to get, they can take your paycheck, they can take your Social Security or your pension, your house, whatever. They can come after you for this money. So yeah, really, really serious issue. You don't want to get on the bad side of the FCC, especially with regard to broadcast interference. And then before we move to some examples of spectrum sharing, I know that Prasant had a kind of a short slide on how the FCC process works, but this is a little bit more in detail. And again, this is something that is actually required under an act back from 1946. This applies to all government agencies. It's called the Administrative Procedure Act, the APA, and it requires government agencies when they are issuing new rules, deleting rules, modifying rules, whatever, they have to follow the Administrative Procedure Act to do it, or else the rule can be considered invalid and they'd have to redo it. So this is what, when I started by saying the FCC can't just issue rules willy-nilly, this is what I referred to. In this chart, before I start, the blue stuff is stuff that the public participates in, provides. The green is the part that the FCC does. Things surrounded by a dash line are optional in this process. They don't have to be part of it, but the things that are in solid black lines, outlined in solid black lines, those are required parts of the process. But this is how, kind of from beginning to end, this is how a particular FCC proceeding, a full proceeding might issue. So let's say you have a great idea for the use of the radio spectrum, but it doesn't meet, it's not allowed under the current FCC rules, and you want to change the rules so that you can do it. What you would do is you would file a petition for rulemaking to the FCC, and it would lay out, what you want to do, what the public benefits are of what you want to do, and how the rules would need to be changed in order to accommodate what you really want to do. You would submit that to the FCC, and it's public. Everything you submit to the FCC is public. It's posted on the FCC's website, so people would see it. At this point, the FCC actually has the option to do nothing. If you file a petition and they think it's silly or they don't know what to do with it or whatever, they can just hold on to it forever. They're not required to actually act on it, but they may act on it. They may just dismiss it because of procedural grounds or because it's just impractical or whatever. They might dismiss it. But let's say you have a pretty good idea. They could put out a public notice. And they could say, hey, somebody, company X submitted this petition to change the rules in the fashion we'd like to know what the public thinks about it. So they put in public notice. They actually publish a thing called a public notice on the FCC website. And that gives the public a period of time, usually 30 days after it's published, to provide comments about what you think. And anybody can file comments. You don't even have to be a US citizen. Anybody can file comments and give an idea of what they think about this. And then there's another typically 15 to 30 days allowed for reply comments. So somebody files comments, you read their comments and you disagree with them, you can reply to their comments and file those. And all this again is public. So everybody sees what's on this because it goes to the FCC website. So based upon those comments and reply comments, the FCC can then, again, either just do nothing, or they can decide, okay, maybe there's a nugget of opportunity here. And they may issue a notice of inquiry, which is basically a fact-finding thing. It's a little longer document that says, hey, we'd like to gather some information. You guys are the experts. What are the pluses and minuses? What public benefits could this have? How does this impact the economy? These kinds of questions. Broader area of inquiry called a notice of inquiry. And then that starts again this comment and reply comment cycle. And then if the FCC still thinks that there's a nugget of something here, this is where they go to the required part of the process. It's called a notice of proposed rulemaking, or NPRM. And the FCC actually says, okay, we propose to change our rules in the following way in order to accomplish something, either something that was petitioned or something they thought of on their own volition or whatever. They can issue a notice of proposed rulemaking. They actually even, like, as an appendix to that notice of proposed rulemaking, or NPRM, they have sort of a change or red line version of the rules and say, this is how we propose to change the rules. That sets off another period of comment and reply comment. And then finally, once they decide, if they decide to change the rules in any way, they issue a report in order, it's called, and it basically gives their reasoning for why they changed the rule, and then publishes in that the exact rule changes that they adopted. And that's in the report in order. And then that is eventually published. And then some period of time after the official publication of the report in order, that rule change takes effect. And then the last step in the process, unless you take the FCC to court, if you don't agree with what they did, you can file a petition for reconsideration. Although unless you point out to them that they made some error under the Administrative Procedure Act or something, petition for reconsideration is almost never successful. It's almost always a waste of time. But you can file a petition for reconsideration if you don't like what they did. So as you can notice, given that the FCC doesn't necessarily have to do anything on a deadline or anything at all sometimes, this process can take a long time. Typically takes years to go through the process. Like our transition to digital TV back in the early 2000s or whatever, this whole process took about 10 years from start to finish to figure out how we were going to change the rules to allow the move from analog TV to digital TV. So it takes a really long time. It can take really long time. There are some proceedings that have been going on for 20 plus years. It take a long time to get through this whole process. So again, emphasizing the blue, you get to participate in the process. Anybody can participate in the process. Individual citizens, companies, other countries, whatever, can participate in the process and file comments. So that is kind of in a little more detail than what you saw the other day, how the process works. And this is, by the way, a lot of times this is how we're protecting the radio astronomy service or the Earth Exploration Satellite Service or whatever, is NRAO and others, NSF and others are filing comments or making their opinions known about particular spectrum issues that might negatively affect radio astronomy. So before I move to the next section, any other, an overview, a little more detail than you saw the other day, but an overview of how spectrum is managed and how people how the government decides who uses what. If anybody has a question, please let me know. Otherwise, we'll move on to a little bit of discussion of spectrum sharing. Yes.
What can the people do when the federal government is in the wrong band?
Is in the wrong band?
Yeah.
So the question was, what can people do if the federal government is in the wrong band? So that would be an issue of you would still go to the FCC because you are, as a non-government user of the radio spectrum, they are your regulator. The FCC would go to the NTIA and work out the issue. So the government shouldn't be in bands that are not allocated to the government. If they are, that should be corrected. But yeah, you would go to the FCC and they would work that out with the NTIA. And there have been issues, not so much that the federal government is operating in a band that they're not supposed to be. There have been some issues of sort of government, non-government conflict in spectrum use. So for example, government through NOAA and other agencies operates weather satellites in near the 24 gigahertz band that observe from space and look at distribution of water molecules in the atmosphere and works out distribution of water vapor in the atmosphere for weather forecasting. The FCC, on the other hand, wanted to auction a band near 24 gigahertz for 5G service and did. And the concern was, even though they're not the same band, the concern was the amount of power being transmitted by these 5G systems would leak into this passive band at 24 gigahertz and cause interference. And there was actually a lot of conflict between the NTIA and the FCC on that. In fact, the NTIA director resigned over that frustration of dealing of the whole issue. So there are examples of conflict between the FCC and NTIA, but again, as a non-government user, if you're getting interference from the government, you would go to the FCC and they would go to the NTIA and try to work out the issue.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes.
So kind of two questions.
Yeah.
How does the public make these comments, and also how much of an influence does that actually make on the rulemaking process?
Okay. The first part of that is easy. So there is a system on the FCC website called the Electronic Comment Filing System, ECFS. That is where you go to file your comments. You can either write a Word document and then submit it, or they have an online form you can do. The second part of your question is a little more nuanced. So the FCC responds better to comments that are well thought out, well reasoned, based on facts, have arguments about public benefits and things like that. They don't like rants. They don't like random people submitting rants. Those kinds of things are noted and then filed away. They want real comments filed. So in a regular proceeding, they do take the balance of information provided and come up to a reasonable decision. They try to do that all the time. In some proceedings, there can be 1,000 comments, and comments can run. This is what I used to do for Google, is file comments on Google's behalf for things that were of interest to us. And some of our comments, by the time you provided all the details, like writing a big report, I mean, it'd be 60, 70 pages long with technical appendices and stuff like that. I mean, it's literally like being assigned a term paper. It's a lot more fun because it's your own, it's because it's something you're interested in, but so it could be, so they like to respond to that. The bigger picture of your question, you might ask, how often does the FCC decide what it wants to do before it embarks upon this process? And then sort of cherry picks the comments in order to engineer a result that supports it. They do that sometimes. I have to say, they wouldn't be appreciative if they were here, and I said that, but they do that. There are examples. In fact, I'm going to talk about 6 GHz spectrum sharing. I didn't put that as part of the presentation, but that, in my opinion, is an example of where the FCC decided on the result they wanted and engineered the process to get them to that result. So,
Andy,
yeah.
Can I just add
Yeah.
something to that? So as a UVA student, and this goes for the other institutions which are SpectrumX member institutions, if you're really interested in this and there's a call for comments or submissions, you are very welcome to work through your faculty. So Prashant, that you met yesterday, and Professor Ghosh, that you will meet later, are the head of our policy working group. So they're in charge of leading any submissions that SpectrumX feels we should be making submissions about. So if that's something you're interested in, just work through your faculty, and you can actually put your name on a submission submitted by SpectrumX.
I would highly recommend, if you're thinking of getting into the spectrum business, that you do that. That you, if nothing else, you help proofread the document. But if you can actively contribute to it, it's fun. And then you got to read everybody else's comments, and then you got to think about if you want to provide any replies to those other people's comments. It's a really fascinating process. I don't want to be too cynical about, most of the time they really are, trying to do the best thing, and your comments will mean something. But sometimes, they engineer solutions, not that much. But yeah, and then there was a question back here.
Sorry, can I just check
Yeah.
if there's any, Maria, do you have any questions from your side?
Yeah. So, what sort of expertise runs the FCC? So you talked about the leadership. Are those engineers? Are they
Nope.
otherwise trained?
Nope. So the senior level of the FCC is almost university lawyers. It's frustrating. The commissioners are themselves politicians, often lawyers, not always. They had a historian at one point, but virtually never an engineer. I can't remember the last commissioner that was an engineer. And then the commissioners appoint head advisors for like wireless or wireline or whatever. Those are never engineers. Those are always lawyers. And then those people have staffs who are never engineers. They're always lawyers or economists or something like, nothing against economists. It's an issue. Now, this has been pointed out to them before. I've pointed it out to them in various things. Why is this? Why don't they have high-level commissioner advisors who are engineers? Their argument is the FCC has an Office of Engineering and Technology that is headed by engineers, very good engineers. They have excellent engineers that work in OET. The Wireless Bureau has engineers that work there, and they're very good, and they rely on those people. So that's great, but those people aren't the really, really senior people that are pushing decisions. The really senior people that actually push the decisions out are the lawyers. But they do have this really good input from OET and from others. So they do have good expertise, but just those are not the ultimate decision makers at the FCC.
Any other questions at Albany?
Oh,
Puerto
there's
Rico? Oh, you have-
there's actually 2 more in Albany.
Okay, go ahead. You all have Andy the whole.
Yeah.
You mentioned the process of making a new rule. Is it the same thing for removing an old rule?
So the question is,
Yes, I heard it. Yes.
heard it?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and actually a timely question, because the chairman of the FCC right now, Chairman Carr, Republican, he is all about, deregulate whenever you can. So he issued this public notice a few months ago called delete, delete, delete. That's actually the formal name, legal name of the public notice, delete, delete, delete. He wanted input on rules that the public thought are no longer necessary. And he was going to basically, his argument was, if the rules are no longer necessary and relevant, that you don't not necessarily have to formally go by the APA. You can just delete them off the books. This is the world we live in now. So he asked for the public to submit suggestions of rules that should just be deleted. And they are one by one going after these rules and deleting them. Now, I had high hopes for this because I had several rules that I thought could be deleted. I didn't file. I didn't really want to be associated with, it's a bit of a circus kind of thing, atmosphere about this public notice. The things they've deleted so far have been pretty benign and kind of wonky legal things that seem to me to be, okay, that doesn't even apply to anything anymore, so they should delete it. They haven't really gotten into deleting just, really important wireless rules or something like that. But the broader answer to the question is yes, if you want to delete a rule and it's not for some reason eligible under this delete, delete, delete proceeding or public notice, you would do the same thing. You would file a petition and request that the rule be removed. But it does have to go through the same process.
Next question at Albany.
Change rules, and then another one was when was the FCC and very conscious of
Okay, so it's a two-part question. How often do rules usually get changed? And then the second part is who enforces the FCC, since there are no timelines seemingly here, deadlines when you have to take an action as the FCC?
Yeah, the second question is easier to answer. Nobody. The FCC is judge, jury, and executioner, so they can pretty much do what they want because they've been given these powers from the Communications Act. And then the first part is the rules are, at any given time, there's usually many proceedings open. So some part of the FCC rules are being addressed almost all the time. A specific rule rarely gets changed, like rules that govern the cellular communications or whatever, those can go years between being changed. But as a compendium, the rules are changed and updated almost daily. I subscribe to the thing that sends you every time the CFR has been modified based upon an FCC rule change or whatever, and I get notifications almost every day of CFR changes. But again, these have all gone through FCC proceedings. So yeah, it's kind of a continuous process.
So Charlottesville, you will have access to Andy for essentially the rest of the day until after lunch. So if you want to continue.
Okay, yeah, we'll do, so come to me right after in the coffee break. Let me just switch. I'm going to give at least one example of spectrum sharing. Why do we need to share spectrum? I think, the answer is kind of obvious because, we've been discussing spectrum issues since Thursday, and spectrum is under high demand. So there is a dwindling supply of spectrum that can be kind of dedicated to a single purpose. When you put out a cell phone system and you pay $81 billion at auction to buy a license, you don't want anybody else using that spectrum. You want it free and clear, and you want to be able to deploy your system and not have anybody else in the way because you've spent a lot of money to acquire that license. The problem is, to do that, you either have to find spectrum that nobody else is using, which doesn't exist anymore, or you have to find spectrum where the users who are in that spectrum can be moved to another band. That's called relocation. In fact, they did that in that $81 billion auction. That was used by satellite downlinks, mostly to transfer like cable TV content around. But the FCC got those people out of that band, made them switch to fiber optic or find some other way to do it, or compress into just a fraction of that band and make the rest of it open. And those companies that paid $81 billion, I didn't know that they also had to pay an additional $13 billion to those satellite companies to allow them to transition to either another band or move their operations to fiber optic cable or something like that. So they paid a total of $94 billion to access that band. The number of bands where you can do that, where you can find a system that can be relocated somewhere else or replaced with a different technology, the number of bands that you can do that are dwindling, basically down to zero, especially in the really high demand frequency ranges below like 10 gigahertz. So now we're at the point where instead of like clearing bands and auctioning it, some bands are going to have to be shared. You're going to have to find ways to share the bands in order to allow for new services to deploy. Now, the discussion of spectrum sharing is a little nuanced and subtle, because you can also argue that we have been sharing spectrum one way or another almost since the beginning of radio, and it's true. There are different ways to share spectrum. You can do it dynamically, like let somebody use it at one time and somebody else use it at another time, the same frequency. Or you can share it in frequency. If you have a band that's allocated for a particular service, you can let one operator use one part of the band, another operator use another, etc. In fact, Starlink is doing this in their Starlink satellite internet service. They have other satellite internet providers, and they all divide the spectrum band up, and they all use their own part of the band. You can also use it in geography, which is sort of like the most basic way of spectrum sharing. If I operate a Wi-Fi access point in this room, somebody on the other side of the building could use an access point on the same channel, because the signals aren't going to interfere with each other because there are too many walls and things in between. So, you're sharing geographically. So you can say that in one way or another, we've been sharing spectrum for years. AM band, FM band, every station uses a different frequency in a given area, that kind of thing. And even in Wi-Fi, you guys, talked about this yesterday. You share in time, a cell phone system, you share in time. When you access a cell phone site and the person right next to you is accessing the same cell phone site on their same cell phone on the same company's service, you time share. Now the time sharing there is on like the millisecond time, like you use it for, these milliseconds and these particular groups of frequencies on that cell, and somebody else is using it for different milliseconds and different groups of frequencies and things like that. So you've been sharing. So when we talk about sort of the modern day spectrum sharing, we're talking about sharing that isn't sort of innate to the system itself. So sharing between disparate systems. So what we've been moving to lately, the two examples, or probably just one example I'll give today, is a database, centralized database-driven spectrum sharing architecture, where there is sort of the central controller that the systems have to reach out to and be told what frequency to use in a particular area. And the central controller takes care of figuring out, knowing where that system is, figuring out what channels and what frequencies are available for it in that location at that time. This can support sharing between very disparate systems. So in the CBRS, the Citizens Broadband Radio Service, what we've done is we've deployed cellular systems in the same frequency band that's used for Navy radars on aircraft carriers. And then in the one I'm going to talk about here, we've also found a way to share a band that's used by 100,000 or more point-to-point microwave links, those big dishes pointing at each other. The FCC did a proceeding where we figured out how to enable the use of Wi-Fi access points like you were using yesterday in that same band in a manner that won't interfere with those point-to-point links, which is what I'll talk about. And some of this it deals with sharing with potentially sensitive things. So you can imagine sharing with the DoD radar, very important thing. And also some of these point-to-point microwave links support like public safety communications and things like that. And so they're very sensitive. You have to find a way that you just can almost guarantee you're not going to interfere with them. And there's been adoption of novel spectrum rates in some of these spectrum sharing, which I probably won't have time to get to, but the user share concept is coming up. So 6 gigahertz band, more spectrum for Wi-Fi. So you asked about, how much does the FCC comments into account? They really do read all the comments and everything. This is an example of, I believe, my opinion, this proceeding was a little bit engineered from the beginning. The commissioners, bipartisan, really wanted to find more spectrum for Wi-Fi. They wanted to get credit for finding it. The Wi-Fi industry convinced everybody that the 2.4 and the 5 gigahertz band wasn't enough. We needed even more spectrum for Wi-Fi. It's a debatable argument, but they were successful and made that argument. And politically, the commissioners thought, hey, if my legacy could be, I found tons of more spectrum for Wi-Fi and everybody uses Wi-Fi, this is a good thing. So in my opinion, this was a little bit engineered, but yeah, so be it. This band is used by, like I said, about 100,000 point-to-point microwave links. These are where these big dishes point to each other and transfer data communications and phone calls. And like when you make a phone call to a cell phone tower that's like out in a rural area where there's no fiber optic cable, what happens is your call goes to that cell tower, and then basically the data are then backhauled to the cell phone company's central office or whatever using these point-to-point microwave links, not fiber optic cable. So it's used for cellular backhaul, used for a whole bunch of things, utilities, public safety. And then in this band, which is like 1200 megahertz wide, each of these systems uses, typically each channel is like tens of megahertz wide. So it's not using the whole band, it's just using a small portion of the band. There's other systems in that band we won't get into, but there's less intense use of these same bands by some satellite services. There's actually an allocation in a footnote for radio astronomy and for passive Earth exploration satellite systems, and also for ultra wideband systems. So your key fob, like this, when you get near your car, it emits an ultra wideband, 500 megahertz wide signal that allows your car to know that you're within like 2 feet of your car. So it knows to unlock the car and stuff like that. So these also operate in this band. So the question was, I won't go into too much detail because we're running out of time, but the question was, could we find a way that you could deploy Wi-Fi access points in this band without interfering with any of these point-to-point links? This is a map of, when you look at these point-to-point links, you have a dish on one tower, it's transmitting to a dish on another tower and then receiving back and things like that. And so we call, geographically the path from this transmitter receiver pair to this transmitter receiver pair as a path, a microwave path. This is a plot of all of the microwave paths in that band. So, on this scale, it looks very dense. It looks like a bowl of spaghetti or whatever. But would we be able to deploy Wi-Fi access points and try and avoid causing any interference to the paths, the microwave paths in the 6 gigahertz band? The answer is that yes, you can, if you're careful about the placement of the access points. So you have a diagram of point-to-point microwave link, which is these two towers talking to each other with highly directional antennas. And the ellipse here kind of represents the area where those antennas could receive interference if something was located in it. If you wanted to use the same frequency for an access point as that link is using on that path, can you do it in a way in the general area that won't interfere with it? And yes, you can. If you put it, behind one of the paths or below the path where these green dots are, yeah, you could probably operate these things. These things only operate at a few watts of power. These things, on the other hand, operate at hundreds of thousands of watts of power. You could operate your Wi-Fi access point and not interfere. If, on the other hand, you put a Wi-Fi access point in near the path, or in the beam of the antennas, or near the beam of the antennas, then no, you probably can't. So the idea was to work out all the details are, how would you have to locate your access points in order to do this? Now, the thing is, who's going to do all of these calculations? If you buy an access point, they're expecting you to do the calculation. You want to put a 6 gigahertz Wi-Fi router at your house. Do you do the calculations and decide whether you're going to interfere with a microwave link in the area? No, that's where the centralized database concept comes about. So again, this was an FCC proceeding, and I'll explain how that centralized database system works here in a minute. This system was actually fairly fast-tracked, started in 2017. Most recent update to the rules in 2024. So we're talking about a 7+ year process, but this was actually a fairly quick process from the FCC. So the access points that they're mostly concerned about here are what we call the standard power access points. And these are the ones that operate at the full power that a typical Wi-Fi access point operates at, which is 4 watts, which is a small power, but it's significant. The other thing the FCC allowed, though, was they allowed low power indoor devices. So if you operated at a lower power, up to 1 watt, and you made sure the device was only indoors, then the FCC says you could operate those anywhere you want. As long as it's indoors and operating at a watt or less, you can operate those anywhere you want. You don't have to go through this centralized database thing called the Automated Frequency Coordinator, the AFC. And then there's another set of devices called very low power devices that if you operate at even lower power, you can use these anywhere in the band. And the power is so low that the FCC decided you're not going to interfere with a fixed microwave link no matter where you are. These would be used for like AR, VR headsets connecting to your phone or something. So the signal only has to go like a foot or two from your head to your phone. But it's the standard power access points, the operating at the higher power. Those are the ones that have to be coordinated. And again, who does the coordination? The benefit that the FCC saw was all of these new Wi-Fi channels that could be deployed in the 6 gigahertz band if they authorized standard power access points and very low power devices and low power indoor devices. We'd have access to all this new Wi-Fi spectrum. And in fact, it has been adopted. It's now built into, if anybody has an iPhone 15 or 16, it's in there. There are these really hideous looking Wi-Fi access points. It's built in there. It's part of Wi-Fi as of Wi-Fi 6E and beyond. So that would be 6E, 7, and 8. 8 is not out yet. 7 is being deployed now. So all new 6E and 7 routers have the 6 gigahertz band built in. Your iPhone and tons of laptops and other things have this new 6 gigahertz Wi-Fi thing built in. Technical rules, again, I'll skip by. But also noting the fact that there is a radio astronomy allocation in there. And as part of the proceeding, the FCC required devices to limit interference into the radio astronomy service. So how does the AFC work? So you bring home that standard power access point, 4 watt thing, you bring it home, you want to use it at its full power or near its full power. You don't have to do the coordination. They're made in a fashion that when you plug them in, the first thing they do is they reach out on their own to a centralized database called an Automated Frequency Coordination System, or AFC system. These are currently operated by 6 different or 7 different companies right now, Google being one of, Google had designed an AFC system. We're not commercially operating, but it was designed. But there are 6 other commercial operators of AFC systems. So your access point connects to the internet on its own, connects to one of these AFC systems, and provides its location, latitude, longitude, or a street address or whatever, and tells the AFC system where it is. The AFC system has gone to the FCC's database, has learned all about all of the point-to-point links that are in the area and what frequencies they're using and everything, and calculates based on where your access point is, where you live, where you want to deploy that access point, and all of these point-to-point links in the area. The AFC system calculates the channels that your 6 gigahertz Wi-Fi access point can use and the power they can use on each channel, such that it won't cause any interference to the fixed point-to-point links in the area. It sends that information back to the access point. The access point then looks at that information and decides which channel it's going to actually use. And in any given area, there's almost always going to be spectrum that the access point can find to use and create that link. And then your access point, at least once a day, has to do that process all over again, has to connect back to the AFC database and make sure that it's still okay to operate on the particular frequency in case a new point-to-point link has come online. So this is sort of the concept of dynamic database-driven spectrum access that is sort of the rage at the moment, is allowing more intense use of spectrum. Remember, what we got out of this was, before now, this band was only used for these point-to-point microwave links. Now they're used for the point-to-point microwave links and millions of Wi-Fi access points, providing more spectrum for for Wi-Fi for broadband communication. So we've gained in a macroscopic sense, we've gained a tremendous amount of spectrum. And I'm gonna, other than questions, I'm gonna end there, and I'll be around for the rest of the day. I do have to skip out at lunch, but I'll be around for the rest of the day. If you have other questions, or if you want to talk about CBRS, I will bore you to death with information about CBRS if you want to get into that. That's another even larger scale spectrum sharing initiative that we've done. So I'm good with questions or whatever we want to do.
I think if, let's see if there's questions in Albany and Puerto Rico.
No brewing, nothing yet.
Okay, Puerto Rico. Okay.
Nope.
No. So Maria, I think, should we break there and then the Charlottesville crowd can ask questions during break time?
We can do that. Yeah, break for coffee and then meet up at 11 for our next talk.
Yeah, let's get us.
All right. See you all then.
Thank you.